Mason Bennett once owned buildings that touched the clouds, but after the crash that killed his fiancée and broke his legs beneath him, the world shrank into a window he refused to open. That night, he planned to sign away his fortune and vanish quietly without a trace. Outside the hospital gate, a blind young flower girl named Grace Miller held out a wilting bundle of sunflowers and asked something no one had dared ask in years. If the sun was truly so beautiful, why would someone who could see it want to let go? The question made him tremble. If that quiet question about the sun already has you curious, stay to watch Mason slowly come back to life. High above the city, Mason Bennett's penthouse was sealed in glass from floor to ceiling, and far below, the streets blazed with 1,000 restless lights. Inside that tower, though, the air felt closer to a vault than a home. Mason sat in his wheelchair before a stack of documents, a will, a transfer of voting power, an order to sell off charitable holdings built by his own hands. He had not been born broken. Years earlier, he had taken a small software company and grown it into Bennett Horizons, an empire spanning real estate, medical technology, and infrastructure worth more money than most nations kept in reserve. He had also once loved a woman named Isabella Reed, gentle in manner but unshakable in will, and the two of them had been preparing to marry when the crash happened. After the crash, Isabella was dead, and Mason had survived with a spine that no longer obeyed him, confined from that night onward to a wheelchair. The press called him the guilty billionaire who lived when she did not, and Mason never once corrected them, because in the quiet of his own mind he believed the same thing. Two figures had stepped in to manage what remained of him. Lucas Grant, the chief operating officer of Bennett Horizons, ran the company in Mason's place with a politeness that never wavered. Amelia Reed, Isabella's half-sister and a member of the board, pressed Mason toward stepping down from the chairmanship altogether. Both of them insisted they only wanted him to rest, while quietly stripping away the authority he had left piece by piece. Far from that tower, in a world with no penthouse, no guards, and no fortune, Grace Miller stood outside a hospital with a small crate of flowers beside her. She wore a worn cream coat, her hair pulled back simply, her eyes unfocused but her face calm and certain. She could not see the people who approached her stand, but she heard everything the world tried to hide in their voices, the exhaustion, the grief, the small unspoken apologies. She sold flowers not to grow wealthy but to cover the rent on a narrow room and to keep her place at Rosehaven, a modest center that had once given her back a reason to keep living. One man owned an entire skyline and no longer wanted to keep breathing. One woman could not see that skyline at all, and yet she still believed each morning was worth waking up for. The main boardroom of Bennett Horizons sat 40 floors above the street, and on this particular morning Lucas Grant stood at its head presenting a plan to sell the land beneath Rosehaven to a luxury housing developer. The board members nodded along, pleased by the size of the profit on the screen before them. Mason attended only by video, his face gaunt, his voice absent from the conversation entirely. Lucas used language built to sound reasonable rather than cruel. Rosehaven, he said, was no longer financially efficient. The vision programs for the blind had fallen outside the growth strategy of the company. Selling the land, he assured the room, would protect the future of every shareholder present. Mason did not object. He looked at the documents in front of him without truly reading a single line. Around the table, executives who had once trembled at his presence now spoke over him as though he were already a footnote in the company's history, a name kept on letterhead out of courtesy rather than respect. The name Rosehaven tugged faintly at something buried, a memory of Isabella once mentioning a place where flowers were grown for patients who could not see them, but the memory brought pain rather than clarity, so he let it slide past unexamined. After the meeting, Amelia called him privately, her voice cool and precise. She told him Isabella would be ashamed to see the company turned into a graveyard for old memories, and she urged him to sign the transfer of voting power over to Lucas. She told him plainly that he was no longer someone capable of leading anyone. Mason did not raise his voice in anger. The most frightening part was that he agreed with her in silence, because he had already lost the will to defend himself. In a drawer nearby sat a watch Isabella had given him long ago, its back engraved with a short line he had not read since the accident. "Look for the sun when you forget your way home." That evening, Lucas arrived at the penthouse carrying the final set of papers. A single signature would grant him full voting authority for the next decade. Mason asked to keep the documents overnight, and Lucas agreed with a show of sympathy that did not reach his eyes, satisfaction sitting just beneath the surface. He set the watch back in the drawer without turning it over, unwilling to face the words carved into its silver casing, though the shape of the sentence stayed with him regardless. hovering at the edge of thought like a door he refused to open. Alone again, Mason wheeled himself toward the window and looked down at the city. He did not see beauty in the lights below, only rows of unfamiliar windows belonging to strangers he would never meet. He decided that the next morning he would go to the hospital for one final examination, sign away the bulk of his fortune to charity, and then quietly disappear from every part of his old life. He believed the following day would be the day he vanished from the world entirely. Instead, the world was about to send him someone who had never once seen the sun with her own eyes, and who would ask him a single question he could not yet answer. Mason left the penthouse close to midnight. He did not want a convoy of luxury vehicles trailing behind him, so he called only Ryan Walker, a driver who had served the Bennett family for years. Ryan grew uneasy since Mason rarely left his tower at such an hour, but he said nothing beyond a quiet question about the destination. Mason answered simply that he needed to reach St. Andrews. A light rain fell as they drove through the city, and Mason watched the streaks of passing headlights bend across the window glass. His mind slipped back to the night of the crash, the sound of brakes, a wash of white light, and Isabella calling out his name in the seconds before everything went dark. His hand tightened on the armrest of his chair until his knuckles turned pale. At the hospital, David Hayes examined him and reported that his body responded better than Mason expected. With consistent therapy, David explained, Mason might regain a measure of independence, enough to stand briefly, to transfer himself without assistance, to reclaim some fragment of a normal life. Mason cut him off sharply, saying he had no interest in selling hope to a man who had already ruined everything that mattered. David did not argue the point. He only said that hope was never a promise, only a task a person chose to repeat each morning. Mason turned away, unwilling to hear more, and wheeled himself out toward the corridor beyond the office. Sitting alone in that hallway, Mason watched families gathered around patients, an elderly couple holding hands, nurses hurrying past with quiet urgency. Every one of them was fighting to hold on to someone. Mason felt certain that no one in the world needed to hold on to him. He opened the folder Lucas had left behind. The first page was the transfer of voting authority. The second approved the sale of Rosehaven. The final page was his resignation as chairman. He picked up a pen, ready to end it there in the corridor rather than wait for morning. Just then, Hannah Walker passed by carrying a vase of sunflowers. Mason asked where the flowers had come from. Hannah explained that a blind young woman sold them outside the entrance and that every week she left a few discounted stems for patients who had no visitors of their own. Mason could not explain why that small detail made him set the pen down. Perhaps it was the word blind. Perhaps it was the sunflowers themselves. Isabella had loved sunflowers more than any other bloom, and the memory arrived before he could stop it. He left the corridor and made his way toward the entrance simply to breathe open air. The rain had stopped by then, and the sidewalk outside stood nearly empty. Only one figure remained near the entrance, a young woman standing beside a modest crate of flowers, her fingers moving carefully along the stems as she rearranged them by feel alone. Mason had no way of knowing that this brief encounter outside a hospital would matter more to him than any billion-dollar meeting he had ever walked into in his life. Grace Miller came into clearer view beneath the streetlight. She wore a cream coat gone soft with age, her hair pulled into a simple knot, her eyes not quite fixed on anything, yet her expression calm and unhurried. A few bundles of sunflowers sat slightly wilted from the earlier rain, and she wiped moisture from their petals without a hint of complaint. Mason stopped his wheelchair in front of her stand. Grace heard the wheels roll across the pavement and asked if he wanted to buy flowers. Mason answered flatly that the flowers looked wilted already. Grace smiled and told him that wilted did not mean worthless, that sometimes all a stem needed was a fresh cut and warm water. That single sentence reached somewhere inside Mason he had thought closed off entirely. He recognized himself in that bundle of flowers, once vivid, now considered used up by everyone around him. He pushed the thought away almost as quickly as it arrived. He asked why she sold flowers so late into the night. Grace explained that daylight hours were crowded, while the darker hours often brought people who needed a bouquet more urgently, some buying an apology, some marking a farewell, some simply hoping a hospital room might feel a little less like a waiting room for bad news. Mason asked if she even knew who she sold to. Grace said she did not need a name to hear when someone was tired. Mason fell quiet, unsure what to say to a woman who refused every ounce of sympathy he had ever offered anyone. He realized, with some discomfort, that he had grown used to people either fearing him or flattering him, and Grace did neither. Grace selected a bundle of sunflowers for him without being asked. He remarked that a blind woman selling sunflowers seemed like an odd little irony. Grace took no offense. She told him she could not see the color yellow, but she could feel the direction a flower leaned, the rough texture of its leaves, the trace of soil still clinging beneath its stem. To her, sunflowers were stubborn things, always turning toward light even beneath a sky heavy with clouds. Mason handed her far more money than the bundle was worth. Grace returned the difference and told him pity had its own scent, and it never smelled half as sweet as flowers. Her quiet dignity stopped him cold, more effective than any security detail he had ever employed at keeping people from pushing past his defenses. A dark car rolled slowly past the hospital gate. Grace tilted her head slightly, as though recognizing the particular hum of its engine. Mason noticed the reaction immediately. The car continued on and disappeared, yet the unease it left behind did not fade so easily. Mason asked if she ever felt afraid standing there alone at night. Grace admitted she feared only the kind of people who assumed that because she could not see them, they could act however they pleased around her. That single line planted a seed that would matter far more later in the story than it seemed to in that moment. Mason prepared to leave when Grace suddenly asked if he could do something for her. He assumed she wanted money, or protection, or perhaps a ride somewhere safer. Instead, she asked a question that caught him completely off guard. Could he describe the sun to her? Mason froze at the question. An ordinary person might have answered without thinking, calling the sun yellow, bright, warm. Mason could not manage even that much. In his mind, the sun was tied only to the morning after the crash, when he had woken to find himself alive and Isabella gone. Grace waited a long moment without pressing him. She simply held the bundle of flowers as though his answer mattered more to her than any payment he could offer. Mason finally said the sun was bright. Grace asked what bright felt like to him. He said it was something that made a person want to shut their eyes. Grace answered gently that perhaps he had never truly looked at it at all. The words were not cruel, yet they cut through him regardless. He had two working eyes, had flown across continents, had once watched sunrise after sunrise from the window of his own private plane, and still the only way he could describe the sun was as something people flinched away from. Grace shared a small piece of her own story. Before losing her sight, she said, she remembered the sun less for its color and more for the warmth on her skin each morning when her father opened the window. Even after she went blind, she kept the habit of turning her face toward the warmest direction in any room. She told him that even when someone could no longer see the light directly, they could still learn to find it another way. Mason answered with more force than he intended, saying that some things, once lost, could never be found again by any other means. Grace paused, then asked quietly who he had lost. Mason gave her no answer. Grace did not push further, though something in her stillness suggested she already understood more about grief than she let on. Instead, she set the bundle of sunflowers gently across his lap and told him that today he did not need to describe the sun at all. He only needed to remember that it was still out there somewhere, waiting, whether he chose to look for it or not. This moment marked the first real turn in Mason's heart. He left without signing anything that night. Sitting in the car afterward, he stared down at the wilted sunflowers on his lap. He realized he had just listened to a woman who could not see a single thing speak about light more clearly than any therapist, any executive, any grieving relative had managed in 2 long years. Lucas called while Mason was still in the car. He asked bluntly whether Mason had signed the papers yet. Mason answered that he had not. Lucas fell silent for a moment before his voice sharpened, reminding Mason that the board could not wait forever on the feelings of a man no longer fit to make decisions for anyone. Mason looked out through the window at the passing city. For the first time in 2 years, he did not feel entirely hollow inside. What he felt instead was anger, not directed inward at himself this time, but outward, toward a man who wanted to bury him alive while he still had breath left in his lungs. He told Ryan to return to the hospital again the following morning, not for another examination of his legs, but to find the young woman who had asked him to describe the sun. It was a small decision, almost embarrassing in how simple it seemed, yet it was the first thing in 2 years that Mason had chosen for himself rather than allowed someone else to decide on his behalf. The next morning, Mason returned to the hospital gate, but Grace was not there. Another vendor mentioned that Grace had received a warning from the building owner over late payments on her small flower stand. Mason quietly filed the detail away. He asked Ryan to look into her circumstances, and Ryan discovered that Grace lived in a modest room near Rosehaven, the very Vision Recovery Center once funded generously by the Bennett Family Charitable Fund. Over the past 6 months, however, that funding had been quietly cut, and the land itself had been added to a list of properties marked for sale. Mason felt a wave of shame settle over him, realizing his own signature had appeared on decisions he barely remembered approving, decisions Lucas had likely pushed through while claiming to act only as a caretaker of Mason's temporary authority. Mason reopened the file on his own accident, a file he had avoided for 2 years because every page inside it summoned Isabella's memory. But the question Grace had asked stirred something new in him, a suspicion that perhaps he had not remembered every detail correctly. Several inconsistencies surfaced almost immediately. The official report claimed his car had lost control due to excessive speed, yet Mason distinctly remembered slowing before the intersection. The report also claimed no second vehicle had been present, yet somewhere in his hazy memory he recalled a wash of white headlights pressing in from the left side of the road. The report further stated Isabella had made no calls before the crash, yet her smart watch had once displayed a deleted call that no one had ever fully explained. Mason reached out to Carter Brooks, a former insurance investigator who had once worked the case before losing his position after raising questions about missing traffic camera footage. Carter told Mason that someone with considerable influence had wanted the case closed quickly. He had long suspected Lucas Grant, though he had never gathered enough proof to make the accusation stick. Mason asked why Carter had never approached him directly. Carter answered that he had sent letters 3 separate times, all of which had been returned unopened from Lucas's own office. Mason understood then just how carefully he had been isolated from the truth. In the following scene, Grace appeared at Rosehaven tending a small garden designed for people who had lost their sight. She guided an older visitor in identifying lavender by scent and by the gentle texture of its leaves, patient and unhurried in her instruction. Mason watched from a distance, quietly struck by what he saw. Grace was not simply selling flowers to survive. She was giving people who had lost their light a place to learn how to stop fearing the dark that had replaced it. Grace recognized the sound of his wheelchair approaching and asked whether he had managed to describe the sun yet. Mason admitted he had not, but told her he wanted to understand what Rosehaven truly meant to her. Grace answered simply that it was the place where she had learned that losing her sight did not mean disappearing from the world. Mason understood then that if he allowed Rosehaven to be sold, he would be doing to Grace exactly what Lucas was already doing to him, declaring someone who was still very much alive as though they no longer mattered at all. Lucas learned quickly that Mason had visited Rosehaven, and he arrived at the penthouse that same evening. This time he abandoned all pretense of gentleness. He accused Grace of manipulating Mason's sympathy for her own advantage. Mason asked why funding for Rosehaven had been cut in the first place. Lucas replied that the company could not keep financing every emotional project attached to Mason's past. Mason reminded him that Rosehaven had been a genuine commitment made by the Bennett Family Fund, not a passing sentiment. Lucas simply repeated that Mason had already signed over temporary operating authority after the accident, and that decision remained fully within his rights to execute. Lucas then reached for a sharper weapon. He told Mason plainly that Isabella had died because Mason failed to control his own emotions behind the wheel that night. He warned that if Mason kept interfering, he would release Mason's post-traumatic psychological records to the board as proof that he was no longer fit to lead. The words wounded Mason deeply, yet he did not surrender immediately. Amelia arrived shortly after, carrying one of Isabella's old scarves, insisting Mason had no right to invoke Isabella's memory as a means of soothing his own guilt. She believed Mason was only performing compassion for the vulnerable in order to repair his public image. Mason did not raise his voice. He asked Amelia only one simple question, whether she truly believed Isabella would have wanted Rosehaven destroyed. Amelia hesitated since Isabella had once volunteered there herself, but Lucas quickly pulled her attention back toward his own plan before the doubt could take root. Meanwhile, trouble found Grace as well. The building owner informed her that her flower stand contract was being terminated immediately. A stranger warned her plainly to stop speaking with Mason Bennett altogether. Grace could not understand why a billionaire's presence in her life had suddenly placed her in danger. When she arrived at the hospital the next day, security guards removed her from her usual spot near the entrance. Hannah tried to intervene on her behalf but lacked the authority to change anything. Grace stood alone in the rain, clutching her crate of flowers, afraid for the first time in a very long while, not for herself but for everyone who depended on Rosehaven remaining open. Word of the situation reached Mason, and he went to the hospital himself without any of the usual display of bodyguards or entourage. He wheeled himself across the lobby under the astonished stares of staff and visitors, the first time the press had seen him outside his tower in 2 full years. Lucas arrived shortly after, pretending concern, framing his arrival as an attempt to bring Mason safely home. He described Grace publicly as a troublemaker exploiting Mason's fragile state. Grace heard the name Mason Bennett spoken aloud and went utterly still, realizing only then that the man she had been speaking with all along was the very chairman selling off the one place that had given her a reason to keep living. Grace felt betrayed in a way she had not expected. She asked Mason directly whether he had come there to purchase her forgiveness with nothing more than a few bundles of flowers. Mason could not answer right away. In that silence he understood, perhaps for the first time, just how much damage his own quiet inaction had already caused. Grace turned and walked away without accepting his offer of help, leaving Mason alone in the middle of the lobby, forced to confront a truth far larger than his own grief, that choosing to live again meant repairing what his silence had broken, not merely refusing to disappear. The board called an emergency meeting soon after. Lucas used Mason's appearance at the hospital as evidence that he was becoming unstable, presenting old press clippings that had once branded Mason the guilty billionaire who survived when his fiancée had not. His goal was simple: to force Mason into signing away his authority before he could reclaim his voice within the company. Mason chose to attend the meeting in person this time. He rolled into the room without hiding his condition behind a screen or a darkened office, refusing to disappear into shadow the way he had for 2 long years. The room fell quiet since no one there had expected him to show up at all. Lucas slid the final document across the table. If Mason signed, Rosehaven would be sold within 48 hours. If he refused, the board would move to vote him unfit to continue leading the company at all. Amelia watched Mason with visible tension, though she still stood beside Lucas rather than against him. Mason did not yet have enough evidence to defeat them outright. He asked instead for a delay of 72 hours to review every document tied to Rosehaven and to the original accident report. Lucas laughed coldly, accusing Mason of stalling everything for the sake of a blind woman selling flowers on a street corner. That insult was enough to change the tone of Mason's voice entirely. He told the room that Grace saw the truth in people more clearly than anyone gathered in that boardroom ever had. It was the first time Mason had defended her openly in front of the people who controlled his fate. A few members of the board began to waver, uncertain for the first time whether Lucas's version of events was entirely honest. In the middle of the meeting, Carter Brooks sent Mason an urgent message. He had located a backup recording from a garage near the original accident site. The footage itself had been erased, but the audio track remained intact, capturing the distinct sound of a second vehicle's engine that night. Mason realized then that Grace might be a witness after all. Years earlier, she had sold flowers near the old hospital wing, not far from where the crash occurred. She had once told him she feared people who assumed a blind woman could not notice anything important. It was possible she had heard or sensed something everyone else had overlooked entirely. Mason left the meeting before signing anything at all. Lucas seethed with anger but could not stop him in front of the full board without revealing his own desperation. Amelia quietly asked Lucas whether there was truly more to the accident than he had ever admitted. Lucas reassured her smoothly, though something dangerous flickered briefly behind his calm expression. Mason went straight to Rosehaven to find Grace. She did not want to see him at first. Mason did not beg for forgiveness right away. Instead, he told her plainly that he intended to stop the sale of Rosehaven whether or not she ever chose to trust him again. Grace asked why he had only begun to care now, after everything that had already happened. Mason answered that until recently he had believed himself already dead, his body simply continuing to breathe out of habit rather than purpose. Grace grew quiet at that, though she still kept a careful distance between them, unwilling to lower her guard completely just yet. When Mason finally asked whether she remembered anything from the night of the accident near St. Andrew's Road, her face lost all its color. She told him quietly that she had never seen the car itself, but she had heard it circle back before driving away. Grace described the memory carefully. She had just finished a volunteer shift arranging flowers at the older hospital wing that night, when she heard a sports car moving far too quickly along the road, a vehicle that clearly did not belong to Mason. After the first sound of impact, she heard a car door open and a man speaking briefly on a phone, saying only that it was done. Then the second vehicle drove away before any police arrived on the scene. Grace had reported what she heard at the time, but officers told her that testimony from someone who could not see held little practical value. Soon after, a stranger approached her privately, warning her to stay silent if she wanted Rosehaven to remain undisturbed. From that moment forward, fear had kept her quiet. Mason felt a fresh wave of pain as he realized Grace had also become a casualty of the very conspiracy that had taken Isabella from him. She was not only the woman whose simple question about sunlight had cracked something open inside him. She had also been carrying a fragment of buried truth this entire time, silenced long before he ever wheeled up to her flower stand. Carter analyzed the engine sound Grace described in detail. The acoustic pattern matched a rare vehicle model tied to a subsidiary company under Lucas's direct control. Location records from that night had been wiped clean, but a small gap remained in the private garage access logs, one Carter could use to build his case further. Lucas soon learned that Grace had spoken. He moved against her more aggressively than before. Her flower stand was destroyed overnight. Rosehaven received an urgent notice demanding an emergency safety inspection, forcing it to close its doors temporarily. Several patient records were quietly relocated elsewhere without warning. Grace tried to appear composed, but panic slowly crept into her voice, not out of fear for herself, but out of concern for every person who depended on Rosehaven's continued existence. Mason wanted to move her somewhere safer immediately. Grace refused outright, unwilling to be tucked away like a fragile piece of evidence, rather than treated as a person with her own agency. Mason learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to protect someone without controlling them. Rather than issue orders, he asked Grace what she actually needed from him. She told him she needed to stand before the board herself and speak in her own voice rather than have someone else speak for her. Mason agreed without hesitation. Later that evening, inside the quiet greenhouse at Rosehaven, an intimate scene unfolded between them. Grace ran her fingers gently along a sunflower leaf while Mason admitted, for the first time aloud, that he feared sunrise itself, since every morning reminded him that Isabella no longer existed to share it with him. Grace answered softly that light never betrayed the people it lost. It was the living, she said, who sometimes chose to lock themselves inside the darkness on their own. For the first time, Mason spoke about Isabella without falling apart entirely. He told Grace that Isabella had once dreamed of building a kinder city through Bennett horizons, not merely a taller one. Mason realized then how completely he had allowed Lucas to twist that legacy into a series of cold, heartless transactions. Grace asked once more whether he could describe the sun yet. Mason admitted he still could not fully, but he offered that perhaps the sun felt something like the sensation of a stranger who still believed he was capable of doing the right thing. Grace rested her hand gently over his. At that exact moment, the lights inside the greenhouse cut out entirely. Somewhere outside, the unmistakable sound of shattering glass rang through the quiet night air. The scene opened in tense confusion. A group hired by Lucas had broken into Rosehaven to seize records and intimidate Grace directly. Mason could not charge forward like an action hero, yet he remained calm enough to coordinate the response with a clear head. He called Ryan to block the exit, called Carter to alert the police, and guided Grace toward a side door by following the sound of running water she knew well from memory. It mattered greatly that Mason was never turned into an unrealistic hero in this moment. He still sat in his wheelchair. He still felt afraid. But he was no longer frozen in place. He used his intelligence, his composure, and the leadership instincts that had built an empire to steady the situation instead. One intruder grabbed Grace by the arm. She did not panic or scream helplessly. She struck his wrist firmly with her folding cane, a motion practiced many times before, and broke free from his grip. Mason positioned his wheelchair between her and the man, staring him down without flinching. Ryan arrived moments later, and police followed shortly after that. The attack drew heavy media attention almost immediately. Lucas attempted to spin the story, suggesting Mason had staged the entire incident to gain public sympathy. But security footage from outside the property and Carter's emergency call together proved that a genuine act of sabotage had taken place that night. The final board meeting soon followed. Lucas remained confident, believing Mason still lacked proof strong enough to remove him from power. Amelia sat beside him, though doubt had already begun creeping into her expression. Grace walked in alongside Mason, no longer framed as a pitiable bystander but standing as a genuine witness with something important to say. Mason opened by refusing to ask for sympathy. He admitted he had been absent from his own company for far too long, and he accepted responsibility for allowing it to drift away from the values it was originally built upon. He made clear, however, that he would not accept blame for a conspiracy deliberately designed to bury him. Carter then presented his evidence to the room. There was the recorded engine sound belonging to a second vehicle. There were garage access records that had been deleted, though a backup copy survived on a secondary server. There were internal messages showing Lucas pressuring investigators to close the accident case before the inquiry had even been completed. There were financial records proving Lucas stood to profit enormously if Mason were formally declared unfit to lead. Grace then spoke, and her presence silenced the entire room. She did not speak at length. She described what she remembered clearly: the first sound of braking, the impact itself, the sound of leather shoes crunching over broken glass, and a man's voice saying only that it was done. Carter played an older recording of Lucas from an unrelated meeting, and Grace immediately recognized the voice. She did not claim to have seen anything. She said plainly that she remembered. Amelia broke down emotionally in that moment, realizing she had spent months helping to shield the very person responsible for harming her own sister, believing all along she was avenging her instead. Lucas tried to discredit Grace, calling her an unreliable witness simply because she could not see. Mason answered that Lucas had assumed her blindness made her harmless, and that assumption had become the single greatest mistake of his life. Mason then delivered the final blow. Isabella had left behind a hidden note recorded within the very watch she had once given him. Carter had managed to recover the data from her smart watch, revealing that Isabella discovered Lucas siphoning funds from the Rosehaven account and had intended to tell Mason everything on the night of the accident. The board voted immediately to suspend Lucas from his position. Police entered the room and led him away. Though he still stared back at Mason as though refusing to accept defeat, Mason did not answer with hatred. He told Lucas simply that he had taken 2 years away from him, but he would never take the next sunrise. Grace heard those words and allowed herself the smallest smile. For the first time, Mason had finally begun to describe the sun. After the ordeal ended, Mason did not return to being the cold billionaire he once was. He resumed his role within the company, but he led it differently now. The sale of Rosehaven was permanently canceled. The Bennett Charitable Fund was restructured openly, with far greater transparency than before. Rosehaven itself expanded into a fuller center for vision recovery, complete with a therapeutic garden designed for adults who had lost their sight later in life. Mason experienced no miraculous cure for his condition. He still relied on his wheelchair through most scenes that followed. He began serious physical therapy with David, some days marking real progress, other days bringing enough pain that he wanted to give up entirely. What had changed was that he no longer treated a difficult day as proof that his life no longer held any value. Grace continued selling flowers, though she no longer stood outside the hospital gate as someone pushed to the margins of the world. She opened a small flower shop beside Rosehaven instead. The shop carried no flashy signage, only the scent of fresh blooms and a small bell hanging above the door. Mason visited most mornings, not to rescue her, but to learn from her how to listen more carefully to the world around him. The relationship between them grew slowly and with genuine maturity. It began as gratitude. It grew into respect. Eventually it settled into a quiet peace, the kind that arrives only when two people no longer feel the need to perform strength in front of each other. Amelia had her own moment of reckoning. She traveled to Rosehaven and apologized directly to both Grace and Mason. Mason did not forgive her instantly, though he did not close the door on her completely either. He told her that forgiveness was never about erasing what had happened, but about refusing to let resentment keep controlling the truth going forward. Amelia accepted his words quietly, understanding that trust would need to be rebuilt slowly, one honest conversation at a time, rather than granted all at once out of guilt or convenience. The final scene unfolded on the rooftop terrace of Rosehaven at dawn. Grace stood beside Mason as the first light spread over the skyline. This time Mason did not look at the sunrise as a man serving out some private sentence. He felt the gentle warmth against his face, listened to the city stirring awake below, and caught the fresh scent of freshly cut sunflowers resting nearby. Grace asked him one last time whether he could finally describe the sun. Mason answered slowly, choosing his words with care. He said the sun was not only the color yellow, it was something that always returned no matter how long or how dark the night before it had been. It never asked whether a person deserved to be lit by it. It simply arrived each morning regardless. And sometimes, he added, it carried the voice of a blind woman who once sold flowers outside a hospital gate. Grace smiled softly at that. Mason did not need to rise from his chair to prove that he had come back to life. He only needed to stop wanting to disappear from it. He held the bundle of sunflowers gently in his hands and looked directly at the first sunrise he had faced without turning away in 2 long years. Mason had once believed that eyes alone were what allowed a person to witness the sun. Grace had taught him something far deeper, that some people lose their sight and still manage to find the light regardless, while others keep their eyes yet must relearn, piece by piece, how to actually live. Mason Bennett had every reason to disappear, yet a woman who had never once seen the sun taught him how to face it again. Grace Miller never asked for pity, and she never gave any either, only honesty, patience, and a stubborn belief that light still existed even when it could not be seen directly. Their story is a reminder that broken does not mean finished, that wealth cannot replace purpose, and that the people who seem to have the least to offer often carry the deepest wisdom of all. If this story moved something in you, sit with it for a moment before returning to your own day. Ask yourself honestly what you might still be avoiding out of fear rather than truth. Sometimes healing begins the moment someone dares to ask a simple, unexpected question, one worth carrying with you long after the story ends.